So while she does that, I'll explain to you. So if you guys have ever done an icebreaker where they're doing a check-in on everyone before they start the presentation, and we want to use a weather metaphor. So I'm going to do mine first to model for you what we're looking for. The weather metaphor is used to explain how you feel. So for example, for me, it's sunny, but with a potential hurricane approaching. Meaning that I feel pretty calm and I feel okay, but I am a little bit concerned with August. And since we're in hurricane season in Texas, I currently feel sunny, but I feel like there's a hurricane in the Gulf that might come. So you can use any sort of weather metaphor.
And all of them are anonymous, so we don't know who said who. If you want to say, I'm the tense calm before the storm, you can go ahead and be poetic.
Yes. So the link is in the chat, and you can we're doing a check-in to see how everyone is feeling.
You can see it now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And you just click on the little square sticky note on the left-hand side of the menu.
Yes. Hey, low chance of sun is still a chance.
Yeah, I was going to say there's still a chance for some sun.
And we're very shiny people, so we'll see if we can make that sun happen. Mm-hmm. Make it bigger.
But I would like more shade.
Yes. Oh, thank you.
Oh my gosh, I totally agree. Thunderstorms are exciting and scary all at the same time. Kind of like the fall. Whatever the weather equivalent is of overwhelmed tonight. High humidity.
Well, it depends what you like. We can get into a discussion of.
Yeah.
Gray, but hopefully the sun comes out soon.
Yeah.
Fine and cool.
I mean, I like that I see a lot of hope.
Yes.
Which is good.
I love it, you guys. Are you loving this interface? This is the first time, spoiler alert, this is the first time we're like using it. That's why it's a little bit.
Very good.
Can they scare potentially dangerous? We said weather, not COVID.
I have a question. Can I ask you something?
What, sorry?
Can I ask you something about this, how do you call it? Jamboard? Do you, everybody has access just with the link, or do you have to read?
Yes, what I did is I did it through, it's a Google interface, so I did it through my personal account, so everybody can have access. If you do it through the RISE account, only people with a RISE ID can.
Oh, okay. But you have to, like in Google, that you have to give like permission to edit. Is the same thing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good.
Okay, so yeah, if we have to do an average, it's a cloudy day.
With some hope.
With some hope. Well, I mean, we don't know. We don't know.
A little bit.
Okay, let's go back to the Canva. So thank you for all the deals. I think my computer is not liking all these things that are going. There we go.
Very good.
Yeah, I know.
We can see it. We can see it, Lujan.
Okay, there we go.
All right. So I will. Oh, thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
So we want to give you a little bit of a context and to explain to you the inspiration behind this workshop. And so we're going to start from the national global conversation down to something very specific that happened at Rice. And then the information we'll share will be applicable to your own language teaching practices. So I don't know how much folks in this group know, so I'm just going to assume that we don't have any knowledge and that we need a baseline understanding. So obviously in May of this year, video surfaced of the death of a man by the name of George Floyd at the hands of police. And this sparked not only national, as you can see from this map, but also global protests around the world in regards to police brutality. Now, Black Lives Matter is not a slogan, it's not a phrase per se. It's an organization that's been around for about 7 years, since 2013. This organization, led by activists, was in response to the death of Trayvon Martin, which was a young man who was killed at the hands of a person thinking that they could and had the right to police their neighborhoods in the way that police officers tend to do. And so we understand, even currently now in Portland, what we're seeing happening is that the communities are responding to violence against underrepresented communities at the hands of police. And this also opened up the conversation for racial disparities and a bunch of other spaces that we've seen. And so those of us here today, we understand that that space includes academia. And as Rosie and Laura were talking about, you know, most of us exist in an academic space that's predominantly white. So it's even more urgent for us to think about what it means to bring together race in our curriculum. Go ahead, Juan.
So a couple of weeks after the murder of George Floyd, our RISE Black Students Association, they published a document with demands. These are the demands summarized in a visual way. I think the 3 demands on the top are more related to the social aspect of the university, the social aspect of campus, so inclusion of hate speech in the code of conduct, the removal of the founder of the university statue. For those of you who are not from Rice, Will Rice was a slave owner, so that's one of the demands, and there's a big statue of him in the middle of campus. Investment in a non-residential Black house, and then more on the academic side per se, they demand the hiring of more Black faculty, professors, well-being counselors, and therapists. Of course, also increasing the number of Black students accepted to RISE. Right now, the percentage of Black students in RISE is 4.93%. And what kind of like touch upon us directly is the inclusion of Black African, Caribbean, Afro diaspora languages in CLIC. We were like specifically named. Regarding those demands, there were at the document they share with the people on campus. There were the demands related to the teaching of languages, of new languages that are more representative of the African diaspora. And on the demand number 19 is the demand that we can actually put our hands to work on, which is shifting the curriculum from an Eurocentric perspective towards a more holistically perspective that takes into account other cultures and not puts the Western culture as the center. So that is in a nutshell what they were demanding. And we took those demands very seriously. So we want to start discussing what do you think also about these demands. So we're gonna go to the breakout rooms. Come back.
Yeah, good.
So does anyone want to start? Yeah, Charla, go ahead.
I can. We only got to the first 2 questions, but I can tell you what we talked about. The first question was, what do we think they're aiming to accomplish? And we talked about representation on campus, and as well as addressing the underlying racism that the university was built on, which, you know, includes the removal of Willie's statue. You know, that's still felt by the community. And we were just starting on number 2, which is, have we ever created or received demands like this before? And we were just talking about how kind of, right, hiring more professors of color and enrolling more minority students. That's as far as we got.
But that's very far. Yeah, I mean, we do this also to our students, right? We give like 10 questions and 5 minutes, but they were more meant to be like opening the floor in case because it happens to me whenever somebody makes a broad question, I'm like, believe it or not. Okay, who else?
I'm going to put Rosie on the spot because she was contributing something important about the struggle between the symbolic and then the things that can actually affect the makeup of campus. If you want to expand.
Yeah, well, of course, like everything comes from what Lucidis was mentioning about, you know, like the students having to make, or not having to make, but you know, like it would have been best if they would make demands that are more palpable instead of just, you know, like saying we want this and not, you know, have like a year or a timeline for that. And but I was also wondering in those demands about the statue, specifically because we are seeing it a lot of on social media. I even made a shirt with one of the statues. That's another story. And I was thinking about how important it is for these students and for this generation to see, to have like a visible and fast representation of their struggle. And I think that I like that. I really like the idea of tearing down the statues and making it visible because it sends a message. But also, you know, like thinking critically, Lucidis was mentioning that some of these places, they do have a visible display of, you know, like painting the street with Black Lives Matter and tearing down some of the statues. There's no actual change. So, you know, like that position between, well, we're seeing it, but it's not actually happening, but it's important to be seen. And how do we follow up with that?
Yeah, we were saying like you can take down the statue and then your faculty are still all white.
Mm-hmm.
But the university can feel good about taking down the statue, right? Like, look, we took down the statue, guys, but our faculty is still 90% white, and so are our students. And so
Those are the statues that they need to see.
Although they
so,
took down that statue too. I mean,
say that again, Melissa.
I said although they could also take down the statue.
Right.
Yes, and
Yeah, that's what we're saying. Yes, and it's like they get away with the easy stuff. Like, well, our job is done.
yeah, Melissa was actually bringing up something really interesting in our group as well, regarding how usually there's a separation at RISE, and I think in every university about what happens outside classrooms and inside the classroom, and how
Right.
these demands actually tackle everything.
Yes. They didn't stay with the symbolic. They tackled both. That is true. Oh my God, these kids are so
Sorry, I'm
smart.
rephrasing you, Melissa.
what I-
yes, go ahead.
Good about it was that they you know, not just demonstrated understanding, but they publicly acknowledged that the choices that you make in the classroom, and this I feel like is like one of the things I've always tried to teach students is like, I'm teaching you this class in a particular way because I made certain choices about it, but that doesn't mean it's the only way to teach it. And actually there's all kinds of assignments, you know, that I use to show them that, like having them write their own syllabi and things like that, right? To demonstrate like the way that you make choices about how you teach a class sends a message about what you think is important.
Yes.
And these demands acknowledge that, right? Like the things that you teach in your university sends a message about what you think is important. And also of course has other effects, like, you know, that people don't learn about those things unless you teach them. And so, you know, their demand for specific courses and specific languages to be taught, I thought really nicely exposed that, and it's something that needs to be exposed. And I also think, you know, by taking it seriously, CLIC is also acknowledging the importance of that. And it would be great if there was some, even though I know I've heard expressed and I understand how the university works very well. So I know that it's not up to any of us whether this happens, and the people in power are not likely to implement it. But if there was some way to create like a public response to that, to show the seriousness with which, you know, we're taking it, I think that's important for the students to see too, you know.
Yes. Lujan, do we want to keep on time? So the third inspiration for what we're doing right now is a workshop that we had in December of 2019. We were fortunate enough to have Dr. Anya come to our center and give us a workshop. And I shared some of those materials with you all in the folder in preparation for today. Her field of expertise is language learning and race. And as you can see here from the article and from her book, that is what she studies. If you could put the next slide, Lujan. So what I did is I summarized for the group. It's a whole day workshop, but I tried to summarize the most important aspects. For those of you not familiar with the vocabulary, DEI is the shorthand that we use in higher education to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the reason it's important to use these three words is because oftentimes at the beginning, diversity was just kind of what happened to me. I was a token Latina and I was placed somewhere and they're like, oh, look, we're diverse, Lucidis is here. And so the field expanded to include equity and inclusion, because it's not just about having token folks in positions that matter. It's about that space being equitable and for inclusion to have a seat at the table when decisions are being made. So the 4 big takeaways that I recalled from Dr. Anya's workshop is number 1, underrepresented students have very specific experiences in the language classroom. And you can think about your own experience if you ever studied the language and draw from that. They also have very specific and sometimes dangerous and unsafe experiences in study abroad, particularly our Black students. I know at least of 4 young Black women in our center who went to study abroad who had very negative experiences, from their hair being touched to inappropriate questions, etc. Dr. Anya also talked about the fact that language instructors, among all the things that we have to do, I understand we're all overwhelmed, we also need to think about access, treatment, representation, and these very specific experiences that students have. She also showed us a protocol, which we're going to sort of example for you in the materials that we're going to share, about how to have an equity-minded approach to language teaching. She shared with us a protocol that we can use to take a look at our materials and to see if our materials are representative of inclusion, diversity, etc. And part of that protocol, and I broke it down, I'm oversimplifying what she did, but for the sake of time, I'm reducing it to this list. So you take your language materials, and the first thing you need to do is have a sense of inquiry. I like to use Brene Brown's word of curiosity. You need to be curious about taking a look at your materials, doing a self-assessment of what you see in your materials, from the images to the approach of content, and then making a plan to take some action on making these materials more diverse, more equitable. She did this for us for our website. We did that for our CLIC website, and Eleve can attest to the fact that we've worked really hard to make sure that our website has a diverse representation. This is important because when students come to learn a language, if they don't see themselves reflected in the website, they're not going to be interested in learning the language, right? And also hiring, right? So if we want to hire more diverse faculty, if your website only shows, you know, middle-aged white dudes, it's not very welcoming, right, to prospective hires or prospective students. So even think about your language webpage for your class, and is that webpage inviting to all sorts of students?
Exactly, that you can do something discursively, but also you can do things that are not necessarily just declaring, oh yeah, I'm a good person, this is a good place to work. Okay, well, what can we do actually about that?
Right, because Lujan and I went back and forth about the idea of faculty just adding a statement in their syllabi. Like, this classroom is diverse and equitable. But if that's all we do, if all we do is put a statement in our syllabus, we're not doing the entirety of the work, right? And so this protocol calls us to look at our materials in a more detailed way, and you'll see that in the materials that we share. And the next slide, we weren't sure if the folks who attended the workshop with us from the center had anything that they wanted to add to this discussion, or anything that I missed from our time with Dr. Anya. I think that's the next slide.
No, the next one is the break.
Oh, it's the break. Well, but did anyone?
I'm playing dumb. I'm like,
Sorry, but did anyone who attended the workshop wanted to add anything about Dr. Anya's protocol. I think Fatima's gonna.
Yeah, Fatima. go ahead.
Yeah, what was really inspirational to me was when she said we need to get to know our students' backgrounds and our stories. I felt like that was the absolute basic she said, and I feel like oftentimes we just kind of focus on the academic, right? But our students come with stories, with lived experiences. They're 18, 19, 20 some year olds, and that has really been very revolutionary for me, at least. So I just kind of, it seems very basic, but it was pretty profound for me, so I just kind of wanted to share that.
Not at all. It's not basic at all. It sounds simple, but as many things in life, the simpler they sound, the harder they are to do. And yeah, I remember towards the end of her workshop, there were two things that really resonated with me. First one, she says, don't be colorblind, be color brave. In the term of call out, if you see something, call it out. And also regarding discussions that sometimes go out of hand, it was about, okay, everybody has the right to their opinion, unless that opinion is actually negating somebody's right to exist. That is something that cannot pass.
And I think that's really important, the don't be colorblind. I don't know how everyone was trained here for language instruction, but I do know that I'm a product of this time of like, you know, we're all the same. I don't see color. And that's not necessarily helpful for people of color because they don't get that privilege of not seeing color or not having to worry about color. So being color brave, the way Dr. Anya called us to be, is really important to understand. And I know with Ella that we've talked about study abroad, we want to have a module where we talk to students of color about race in the country that they're going to go visit, because we can't send our students abroad and not prepare them for the potential racism that they might face. Particularly in our case, and I think Dr. Anya's example was also a young Black woman in Spain. It's sort of a pattern of this happening when they go to Spain. So we need to be aware of that. I know our one Black student who went to China also had a little bit of unsolicited attention. He took it with a grain of salt and he tried to be positive about it, but it was documented that he received a lot of attention that was unwanted when he was in China. So I think it's worth us investing in that. So
yeah, and I think we're not going to prevent if something it's bound to happen, it's going to happen, but at least if they are prepared, they know that they can either like come talk to us that that's not okay, and that we can be a source of comfort or even fight for them if that's the case, if it is so.
Anya, yeah. Question about that. Do you suggest like we just, address racism in our classes more? I feel like that's something we should definitely do and just talk about race in general, but like, how do you necessarily prepare someone for that, for study abroad? And so I'm getting off course.
No, not at all.
Yeah. I would say go ahead. I would say off the top of my head, you need to bring in students who experience this.
Yes.
Okay.
So one of the things that Lujan and I went back and forth with was, well, who are we, two white presenting Latinas, to hold a workshop on race and language, right? And so one of the things that we realize is there's two things that are going on. There's a lot of extra labor being asked of people of color to explain everything that's going on. So that was sort of our motivation. We're not going to go ask the two Black people at Rice to come teach us, right, what we're supposed to be doing. So our motivation was, we need to be responsible for our own education. We got a training. Let's go back to that training and kind of think about it. So it's a double-edged sword to say, ask the Black students who have had bad experiences to come speak. But at the same time, if me and Lujan, or even you, we were to stand up there and let me tell you how to be okay by being Black in Spain with my pale self, it's also not useful.
Yeah, we did it when I was running the program in Buenos Aires. In the pre-departure orientation, we actually brought a student that also was a first generation student. And I just let her talk to the guys, because also when you receive advice from someone your own age, you are more willing to listen, because like, okay, this actually happened to me. So yeah, but we're going to talk about some of those things after the break.
Okay.
And thank you, Laura, for sharing the source on
That's
the chat.
that's an amazing, amazing book. I would say to Acha that I think at the beginning is just being honest about identities and like, you know, having a frank conversation about like how we hold multiple identities and how that changes, right, when we change spaces. I think that's just the baseline, no?
Absolutely.
Starting point. I'm a big fan of that book, of her work. It's Anu. I'm sorry. It's not Annie. It's Anu. Anu Taranat.
And if I may add something, one thing that I also do, at least with my students in certain units, especially when we go to physical descriptions, is to talk a little bit about vocabulary and implications of the use of certain words in certain contexts, and how discrimination and prejudice is behind the use of certain words and things. So I think there is a lot of content related to race that we can incorporate when we are teaching vocabulary, when we are teaching social encounters, when we are teaching things that we can compare to cultural aspects in the US. So in my 300 level, I have a unit in which we talk about racism in Brazil and the US, and how this is tied to slavery, and how slavery happened here and there, and why we have the discourse of Brazil not being racist and where it comes from. So we discuss a lot of that as part of the content of the course. So we can also incorporate historical aspects, cultural aspects that are related to the language, and have those discussions with the kids.
Yes, absolutely. And after the break, which is in 2 minutes, we're going to talk about different activities where we can enhance those conversations in terms like, well, maybe some of the discussions are more particularly related to the language proficiency. Some of the discussions are more suitable for third-year classes, or what can we do if we are teaching, if our language, for instance, doesn't have third-year classes? I mean, what can we do to at least try to acknowledge all this? I'm building suspense, right?
And I also wanted to ask, do you have any resources for teaching language, like textbooks? Because that's what I struggle with the most, you know, like what are some textbooks that are not only including, like, for example, and this is something that I don't like, whenever they talk about, you know, like Caribbean or the diaspora or the exile, these books that I have encountered, they mostly include like the very colorful and flamboyant when they talk about, you know, like people of color. And they reserve, the philosophical and, you know, like poems and things like that for the more Eurocentric. So that's what I try to do in my language classes.
We're gonna talk about that. But I have a feeling we don't need a break, Lujan. We're just like on a roll.
I think people don't need to pee anymore. I don't know. I mean, unless quarantine.
Unless somebody's dying to have a break, I think we just do it.
Sorry, but to acknowledge your comment, yes, of course, we should all start like our own editorial house. And, no, but seriously, and we were just discussing with a colleague of us, with Kevin the other day. Remember, Lucidis? Yeah. He was like actually sending us snapshots of the book he's using to teach Spanish, and there was this so unproblematized version of the conquest, of the genocide that was perpetrated in the American continent, and the good side of the conquest. You know, we all speak Spanish now. Yay! We should be grateful. I actually has been said that That was said to me once, that I should be grateful that I have the language. By a Spaniard, of course. Right? I love Spaniards. I have friends. I have Spaniard friends.
Oh my God, do not say I have friends that are from
I
Spain.
know. I
Oh
did
my
on
God.
purpose. Okay, I guess everybody's bladders are okay.
Let's do it.
This is being recorded anyway, so.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so I will start with my materials. So the way we wanted to do this is to show you what were we doing, what did we modify after the workshop, and of course we're gonna have time for questions or comments. Please help us and feedback. So I brought two activities. The first one is more sort of basic, but we're gonna talk about it a little bit. And the second one, the first one is more related to word image and word association, and this, depending on what you talk about after doing it, could be adapted from first year to third year to whatever you want to do. The second one is something I use for third year, and it's based on an article published by El País, which is one of the biggest newspapers from Spain, you see, that includes an article and also a video, and it talks about immigration and the new phase of Spain. So for this first one, what I used to do is I would just let my students see those images and just tell me how would they describe these people, right? So of course you see that representation is not very good in this, the diversity representation. So what we do now, okay, did I mention that my computer is, and this is something we can also use in, now that we are mostly teaching online, is we do activities with Google Images. So what I send them out to do is I send them out to look out for adjectives that don't have gender markers. For instance, inteligente. And just look on Google Images. What do we see? And then they have to describe me, because I don't have their computers. I don't see what they're seeing. So like, okay, describe me what you see in terms of race, gender. Sometimes, I mean, for instance, with intelligence is always related to work. So, and then scroll down and tell me how long you have to do before you find a different person of the first 5 that you encounter.
So we see a dog before we see a person of color. Is this?
Yes, and this is a meme actually. So it's kind of like a, yeah, we see like graphical representation, so nothing. So one thing is to look up for intelligent. What if we look for indigent? Which is a fancy word for poor people. And I'm not making this up. This is from my computer, right? What are the representations we can see? So this is a fun activity that we can either, I mean, for first year, we can say, okay, in Spanish, we very easily learn who are they? Who are they? How many people are that are whatever? And adjectives is kind of like a thing that we always are coming back to. And then for more advanced levels, we can also elicit a discussion. Okay, why would you think this is? Why, what would you like to look at? And if you want to like make it a twist too, you can also make them to look for adjectives in English, because sometimes is when we're teaching another language, it's like, oh, that culture has problems. Oh, that word is like really seriously in need of more diversity or whatever. And then you can do the same adjectives in English and you will see kind of like the same results. So that's for the first one. And
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure, no, please.
Before you move to the next one, I'm just curious how the students react, or what are their feedback when you present them with this?
It's really hard sometimes to elicit the answer you want, because I mean, I want them to know that even if the adjective has no gender markers, it's gonna be a white male everywhere. So I have to make follow-up question. Okay, what do you see? We see a person. Yes, cool. How is this person? And I make them look up like 4 or 5, and then I make them discuss in small groups, and then we go back to the big group so nobody is singled out. And usually they are shocked because they haven't done this. And I always tell them, this is something Laura will recognize because I stole it from a professor from our alma mater, that Google Images is the subconscious of the internet. So they are usually shocked, and then I make them, if we have the language proficiency, and if we not, you can switch to English for 5 minutes, nobody's gonna die. Then we talk about how, if this is representative of what you think when you see that word. So they get a hold of it. I mean, they like it. And they are more prepared to talk about gender bias than race bias, because it's safer in some way. But when we intersect gender and race, that gets kind of like difficult for them, but it's fine. I mean, and they don't have to be like comfortable all the time. But yeah, it is hard for them to actually verbalize what I'm looking for. So I just keep asking questions, and I play dumb, like, oh, I cannot see what you're seeing. And of course I can, because I'm doing the searches by myself. But like, oh, tell me more. That's answer your question? Okay, I did. So the second one, I'm gonna put it like this, and then I'm gonna, it's, as I said, yo también soy español means I am also Spanish, and it has to do with immigration, and it has to do with first generation Spaniards that don't look what you expect, what people would expect. So again, I use Google Images as well and I make them look up for nationalities to see what it appears. We can do it, but I don't want to run out of time. So I used to do this activity, and it was more like a content-based activity, like, oh yeah, go read this article. You see, oh, so nothing was happening. So what I'm doing now is I'm scaffolding a little bit the activity, and I make a pre-activity before they go to this article. For instance, they can pair and describe a person from Spain. If they don't know anyone from Spain, they can look at the book, at the textbook for Spaniards. What are the Spaniards that are represented on the textbook? Or they can Google famous people from Spain. What do you find? And then we go to this video. And the thing, the video and the article can be adapted for different levels. You can do like a comprehension activity. They also talk about real life experiences. So they can, like, I don't know, from fill in the blanks to talk about the experiences and discuss why. And if you want to take it like to the next level, which I always do because I'm a pesada, you can also talk about how common or how historically representative is to think about Spain in terms of white people, where you can have, and I looked it up, Al-Andalus, who was the Muslim Iberian Peninsula, was there for almost 8 centuries. We had the Reconquest in 1492, that is like 5 centuries and a half, mostly. So you can also go to that. I mean, you don't have to, but you can also go to that, say, hey, why do you think the whiteness of Spain is so enforced, even though the history proves the contrary? But again, I'm very pesada, I'm very dense. So yeah. Lucidis, if anyone have any questions or comments, we can like address them.
Thank you. And then after this, we'll break into small groups so we can brainstorm about what you saw. So I'm also going to do like Lujan. I'm going to show you a first year adaptation and then something for advanced students. And I'm going to touch upon the question that Rosie had about books that don't have diverse content. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a typical quiz from first year Spanish. I'm sure all of you, when you teach first year, whatever language, you have a section where the students learn the vocabulary for professions. So here I was doing my typical instructor job, created my quiz. I feel that I'm a very aware person, but apparently back in the fall of 2017, I was only capable of producing white images for professions. This is full disclosure. I know that the image for number 6, he is Mexican, but he's still white presenting like me. So even me, who I'm a US Latina, and I think that I'm very aware, I was capable of subconsciously producing a quiz that was monolithic in the images. Then, because I became aware of this, you can see version 2 on the right-hand side, where I made sure not only to have a diversity of gender, but to have, cultural and ethnic diversity that can still obviously be improved. And some of you might look at this and say, well, oh my God, this is so basic, why does this even matter? But those of you that might be informed about recent, and not just recent, general research on education, when students see themselves reflected in the materials that they're using to learn, and they see themselves reflected in the instructors that are teaching them, they're going to do much better, right? Particularly when you think about your own experiences learning, right? And the power that seeing yourself reflected has. So that's why I titled this slide, Representation Matters. Because if you're too scared to have the race conversation, if you don't feel prepared to have a full-blown discussion about racism, you can take this very small step, which is making sure that your materials that you use for assessment, the PowerPoints that you use to teach vocabulary, the images that the students are going to be taking in are diverse. And in my case, I obviously added images of Black professionals, but I also want to, in the future, think about LGBTQ images. So when we're teaching marriage, the textbooks are always going to have a heterosexual couple. And I think Lujan and I have talked about this before. So making sure that my images represent a diversity of realities. And it's very small. And I think that I would say that if this whole conversation that we're having and this whole idea of race is a little bit overwhelming and is scary to you, I would invite you to take this small step. Just go to your materials and change the images that you are providing for your students, particularly for less commonly taught languages. I think in the case of going back to that student Craig, who's a young Black man learning Chinese, it would be very powerful for our Black students who are interested in learning Chinese, Korean, Japanese, to see themselves reflected as potential speakers of those less commonly taught languages, right? One thing that I struggled with is that I would say, well, my images just need to be Spanish speakers that are diverse. This material, there's no audio link to it. So your images just need to be diverse to reflect the reality of the world. And so I thought I would start with this very tiny, small thing. Now, mind you, I thought that my stuff was diverse. So another feeling that might arise is, well, I'm sure that my materials are already diverse. Don't be fooled. Lucidis back in fall 2017 totally thought she was diverse, and look at her with all her cartoons and white images. So going back and looking at our materials and taking a look at that is a very small step until we feel comfortable going to the next level. And I will take the next slide. So as a baby activist, when I first started teaching, I just taught my students about all the horrible things that were happening in my community and all the injustices. That was my first iteration as an activist, right? And so that's all I ever fed my students. It was like, we're suffering, this is our struggle, blah, 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 right? And then I started to realize, wait a minute, like, yes, we struggle and we suffer, but we also have joy and we have excellence. And so there's 2 hashtags that are really important that are in Instagram, which is Black Joy and Black Excellence. And these hashtags were created to counter the stereotypes that often situate underrepresented groups in the context of oppression, violence, and entertainment, right? So let me show you how cool the African music is from our country. But I'm not going to show you all the thinkers and all the other contributions that our communities have made. And so I had to remind myself of this, that I needed to balance both the representation of my communities and their struggles and their joy and their excellence, because we have both. And so I had to go back to my materials, and you're going to see how this changed. So if you can go to the next slide, Lujan. So baby activist Lucidis had a lot of issues. First of all, she only thought that the only Black speakers of Spanish were in the Dominican Republic because my 3 examples of my lesson plans are all from Dominicanos. So apparently that was how far my research went. And then if you look at the 3 images, my 3 lesson plans were all about struggles. The first image is of a young Dominicano who was beat up by the police in New York. The second image is a young woman who talks about hair discrimination that's faced by Afro-Latinos. And then the last, my most embarrassing admission is Afro-Latinos in poverty, right? And this was the limits of my contribution of being woke and contributing to the knowledge of my students on racial disparities and so forth. And so I was able to sit back and say, I need to say yes and. Yes, these things, and Latino, Black Latino excellence, Afro-Latino joy, etc. And so what I did is I thought, okay, I need my students to be able to see Afro-Latinos and underrepresented groups talking about something other than struggle too, right? So I kept those 3 lesson plans and I added 3 new ones, right? It took a lot of research, it took a lot of time, but it was worth it. So Zoe Saldaña, who's an Afro-Latina, she's being interviewed to just talk about raising bilingual children. She's not being interviewed about any struggle that she faced in Hollywood, which she did, but it's just refreshing to allow students to see underrepresented groups talking about positive things, talking about things that don't have to do with struggle. The second is a doctor who was nominated for a Nobel Prize. He's Dominicano, so I still need to get out of La República Dominicana, I need to travel. He is just being interviewed for his contributions to the community and for how excited he is to have been nominated for a Nobel Prize. And then the last image is for the future. So I don't know how many of you feel this way, but oftentimes I get caught up in like, I'm an academic, I gotta talk about serious stuff, I can't talk about fashion. But fashion can be political, and the fact that this young woman at the bottom, Karen Vega, has become the first Oaxacan woman to be on the cover of Mexican Vogue is a big deal for what is being represented as beauty and what is being accomplished by having these images. So we don't need to feel that the only way to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion is by always focusing on the struggles of our communities. We can have both. We can educate our students about the struggles that our communities face, but it's just as important to educate our students about the joy and excellence that exists in our community without falling, and I think this is what Rosie was saying, without falling to stereotypes and being like, let me show you Celia Cruz. Look at her dance, right? I think that's important. Now, how you go about that, it's not that I knew about this Dominican doctor, is I thought about the topics that we generally see. So I would put like, Afro-Latino and Nobel Prize, Afro-Latino and philosophy, and just go and search for these stories, because like Google Images, like what Lujan showed, they're not going to be the first thing to appear. And you do what you normally do is you take this media, you take the transcript, you take the content, and you can, I would say you really shock students when you bring media and content that have Afro-Latinos in them and you don't focus on struggle. You shock them. And you just focus on excellence and you focus on the person's, accomplishments. You really shock students, because I think we've hyper-corrected and now we're solely giving them images of struggle and we don't show them the excellence and joy that exists in our community. And I think that's important.
I might add something that is kind of like an idea that Charla and I have been doing for the 300 levels, is also with the movies we show. Because usually for Latin American movies, it's documentaries about how much poverty there is. So what we did is like, we don't erase that content, we made them a playlist of options that they can choose from. So if they're in the mood for watching a comedy, okay, go watch a comedy. We can analyze everything, but it doesn't have to be the representation of, in my case, Latin America or in the case of Spain, the dictatorship, and I'm from Argentina, so the desaparecidos and everything that you can. It's not that we're moving forward that, please don't understand this from this, but it's like there's a lot of representation. It's not the only thing that is being produced in Latin America.
Well, because we're also not representing ourselves as whole human beings with struggle, with excellence, with joy. I mean, that is the privilege of, quite frankly, white representation that gets to have a fullness of representation that our groups often don't have. So I think if, again, I'm speaking to those that are a little bit scared. So if you're a little bit scared to get into the racial conversation, I would encourage you to maybe think about this iteration that I'm showing here, where you're just presenting different images and having them seen through the lens of excellence and joy. But I would be careful with the joy, right? Because we know that there is tendencies to, especially, Black culture, to be a caricature, and we're just here for your entertainment and we're going to dance for you, etc. And if you can go to my last slide, Lujan. So I would say overall, for first year, I'm going to go back to the thing about a textbook. I know that I saw some suggestions in the chat about textbooks that might be more culturally sensitive. One conclusion that I've gotten to is that textbooks, they age too quickly. And although it requires more work on my behalf, I've stopped trying to search for the best, most representative book. So what I do is I actually use a traditional book, and as part of their homework, they're asked to deconstruct. So in the case that Lujan and Rosie were discussing, you always have at the end of first year books, usually the last page is a little cultural note, and it's in English, right? And it's an image. I would encourage you to not just use those cultural pages as they come. I would create a handout, and I would have students answer questions in English, which is fine for first year. Who is being represented in these images as the cultural representatives of this X thing? Who is missing from these images, right? And what message is this textbook conveying to us? Now, yes, sometimes students get a little bit like, why is she having us critique the book that she chose for class? So I do have a candid conversation with my students about the limits of materials that are diverse, are sensitive to these issues. But I'll tell you this much, they really enjoy the deconstruction of the textbook and being able to shade it and critique it and answer these questions about what is a textbook telling me by having these images here. As Lujan shared, vocabulary is a very simple way to have first year students work with images. I would say always use a textbook as a comparison tool. So who is being represented as a Spanish speaker, who is not, etc. So I would say instead of investing time in trying to find a better book, I would create really cool activities where you're just critiquing and you're breaking down this book. Once the students have learned that skill of critiquing that cultural page, they will start doing it on their own. So for example, I'll start a new chapter and then out of the blue on their own, look, profe, we don't see anybody who's not white in this page. And so then it becomes a habit.
They get the pitch very easily.
Yes, they understand. And so then throughout the semester, their approach to the materials is much more critical, and it's not this thing that I have to elicit from them. For second year, you can do all of the above and you can have more complex discussions. The other thing I was gonna say is if you find it to be overwhelming for you to have to find materials, it's actually a good exercise to have students go out and find the materials that you're looking for, right? So can you tell me who was the first Black person or Afro-Latino to win a Pulitzer, or to do something excellent, or who's a philosopher who's famous that is from the Afro-Latino community or so forth, and have that be their homework and they bring the materials to you. I think we're often stuck in the idea that, well, I can't find materials that are diverse, so I'm giving up. I think if we flip it and we put the students to work, it's a nice way for them to learn how to do research. And then they get to bring the materials to class, and then obviously you can keep them and use them for the future. We didn't include in this presentation how to facilitate these tough conversations. I know Lujan and I have had experience facilitating these discussions. As you can imagine, at Rice, we have students who have, I don't know what adjective to use, different points of view. So that would be for a future conversation. But I think what we try to do is just to offer some simple ways to start, especially for our colleagues who maybe had not thought about race in their language classroom for whatever reason. I think Spanish cannot escape it. But I know that for other languages, it's a little bit harder. And with that in mind, I think now is a discussion portion.
Yeah, but before, I think Martina had a comment.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing all this up. I think also I'd like to add that we also come back here a little bit to what Fatima said in the beginning. It's one thing that we raise awareness, and I love that what you said. It's fabulous. I will definitely incorporate this. I wasn't even thinking about that, to broaden that, and fabulous. But also what Fatima said in the beginning, really to learn also from our students and ask them for the background, because I think that will also add to this rising awareness and broaden the whole context. I really like that, to bring all this together. It's really a very good development here. I love it. Thank you. I just want to say that.
I didn't know she had like a compliment. I thought it's not like I mean. Okay, so shall we?
Yes.
You all have the PDF with the questions. So shall we go to the small groups and
Yes.
then go back with
comments?
comments?
Send y'all out and see y'all back in a few.
Okay, does anyone want to share?
As I say to my students, voluntarios o víctimas. It's my students' call. Is everybody back? Yes, everybody's back.
Sí.
I mean, I'm going to call out Fatima because I want Fatima to share what she shared with us about that for her, the new idea of showing the excellence and joy.
Yeah, I mean, I also commented in the chat that, you know, truthfully so, I was not even considering, you know, I've really tried to make an effort to diversify, you know, my examples, but, you know, it's always a struggle. So it was really very mind-opening for me now when Lucia shared that, no, you also need to include the success stories, and there are so many, and it's really not hard to find. I could think of so many examples, and also not necessarily the soccer stars, you know, that are always right, Luciris,
yeah.
Lujan put out there as the successful integration. Oh my, look at that. But in all fields, and I think I always strived on is hearing stories where struggle led to success, you know, and I feel like looking at the room now, we're all those stories. So sharing that again, you know, those are our personal stories and inspiring our young folks through that. So I think that's a point I want to make to move away from the failures. And yeah, in the end, it just, sorry, didn't work out. The society, the education system failed them. I'm thinking of Germany now, but thinking of the success stories, looking to politicians, looking to academics, and how inspirational they can be, very powerful. So
I mean,
thank you.
You guys' biggest philosopher right now is from South Korea, but he did his whole career in Germany.
Yeah,
and
which who you introduced me to.
Well, my students don't like him. We discuss him. I was like, oh my God, please stop, señor. Pero.
But I think what the general consensus was to normalize. We've normalized struggle, right? I think I'm a product of that time. I was sharing with them of my militant Chicana education. So we've normalized struggle, but we also need to normalize excellence and joy.
Because we think we're fighting the good fight.
Right.
I mean,
well, and you can do both, right?
Yes.
So it's not that I'm choosing one or the other, it's the and. It's that there is a struggle. And then we were saying, like, if I know the struggle and then I see this excellence and joy, that makes that excellence and joy even much more meaningful, because it's despite that struggle that you can see this beauty that's created through art, through poetry, through philosophy. So the way that my class at the 300 level has changed by me including both the struggle and the joy, it is amazing. And I don't want to produce students that are like, oh my God, the only thing I know is the struggle. You're going to know the joy too, and you're going to know the excellence of art.
Yeah, here Laura in the chat says it also fits into white saviorism.
Oh my God. Yes. Yes. Which, yes. I mean, anytime I send, it's just, well, because I teach an internship course and I send the students out to the community to help at hospitals. And it's like, oh, these poor people, they need so much help. If I wasn't here, and I'm like, well, calmate, calm down. Yes, thank you for your help. But like, our communities are also very resourceful, and we have found ways, despite not having access to things, we have found ways to get things done, right? And so the internship is a really touchy subject because these kids are like, I'm doing something great for the community. How dare you make me question my wonderful contribution, right?
And I think that, and I think that is so difficult because my students also go into the community, and at Texas Tech I had like half and half, so half were like white, and then the other half were Mexican and Puerto Rican. And it was very difficult because I really wanted for the Mexican American and Puerto Rican students to feel a sense of like ownership and like pride, and to feel that their cultural knowledge helped them in translation and medical Spanish and everything. But I will always see like my white students being like so empowered by being able to help them, and my Mexican American Puerto Rican students always like worried that they were not doing enough. So that's also what I encounter in that experience with internships and going into the community.
It's true. I have the same lack of diversity, or whatever, 50-50. And I think one thing that I find to be the next frontier for heritage speakers, which is probably who you're referring to, Rosie, and any heritage speaker, we have heritage Chinese too, is that we don't really let students know how powerful them having access to the community's version of Spanish is, right? I think they really respect professional Spanish and doctor Spanish, but they don't have a clue of how powerful it is for them to be able to take information that's so complex and make it accessible to a community who wouldn't have it otherwise, and that connection that they can make to our community. And so I think critical language theory is really helping us reimagine what a non-academic Spanish or language can do. These kids need to feel like really proud of the fact that they can navigate these spaces.
We were just discussing that in our group, also to the inclusion of Spanglish as a variety, because it is a variety of Spanish. And actually it's talked by more people than the population of Spain.
Yeah.
And I have nothing against Spain. It's just imperialism.
This whole presentation. No, I think Spain is like number 4 now. I think it's Mexico, US, Colombia, and then Spain. Yeah. So why we're still in love with teaching the Spanish variety, I have no idea.
Well, imperialism. But yeah, I usually tell my students, okay, how would you feel if when I switch to English, I would be talking British English? You will feel this. I mean, that's the English I was taught. And so, so I don't know if you can see it in the same link we share at the beginning, the Jamboard link. We have a new board. I think nobody's being super shy in case somebody wants to share something.
If there's a question, I mean, I think we covered all the questions in the frequently asked questions. We try to approach this conversation to speak to both folks who had never even thought about race. So there might, for some of you, some of this might have been obvious, but we try to reach 2 audiences, an audience that had no idea or feels that their language, I would imagine something like Russian, right? Who would feel like their language has nothing to do with race, to a language that's more embedded like French and Spanish, where we have a very sort of obvious presence of racial issues. So we try to cover both approaches. I think for the future, it would be useful for those of you that do feel comfortable bringing up these issues, how to manage these conversations in the classroom, because I know the very first time I did it, I got very sweaty and I got very nervous when there was a student who was not on board with diversity and equity. And so how do you handle that in the classroom and not like go off on a student and like lose your job? So we thought we would start with the small things and move up to the more complicated. So maybe in the future.
Rosie actually had a really good question on our group regarding that. Do you care to?
Oh, me? Yes. I was like, yes, I was talking about that. What was I saying? I lost my track. I was focusing on what you were talking about.
It was about mostly the
Oh yeah,
resistance.
if our students are ready, and how can we read the room to see if our students are going to be receptive to the conversation, or if they're going to be defensive. In my case, I was sharing that I had a heritage speaker class, and it was like one of my first classes when I started teaching, and I went like very strong with, like showing the other view of the conquista, and how it really affected the native communities and stuff like that. So the students, whenever they were writing their reflections, they would mention, like, oh, but, like, thanks to that, we have, like this. And so they were defending it. So I later found out that they were not ready. They didn't like that approach specifically. So I was wondering how you guys encounter that idea of getting to a conversation from a safe space.
I was sharing with my group that RISE students are extremely polite, so they will not say anything in class. Maybe they will go as far as to say, she's so opinionated in the surveys afterwards. So I personally never had like a resistance, like a specific, not specific, but like, you know what I mean? Like someone like even with the body language or whatever, resistant to this conversation. But I kind of like want that might happen, because that will give me a clue if I need to like redo something or improvise something. So I think it's a really, really important thing. And I think it's a thing we have to need to take into account, that the fact that they're not complaining or resisting us because we are the authority in the classroom, that doesn't mean that this message is coming across as we intended it.
But I would say that the answer is what we learn when we're teaching any language concepts is to scaffold. I feel like Rosie and I were probably trained by the same leader. Like I went in like, we're going to do this. We're going to march after class, kids, get your books. And I had to refine my delivery. One, because they're young. Two, because maybe this is the first time that they've ever even been asked. I think Divya was talking about that, right? We're assuming we are seasoned professionals on a lot of these topics, and we assume that sort of comfort and knowledge from our students. These are young kids. Maybe this is the first time they're ever talking about race. So I had to refine myself and my delivery and actually put a lot on them as far as like, here's a pre-class couple of questions that you can just write about without having to discuss. And here's a little tidbit. And I have found throughout the years that it's much more productive to like sneak it in. And then all of a sudden they realize what happened, rather than me going in so hard. At least in my view, a very good scaffolded little by little. And also giving students room, and I don't know if I've shared this before, it's okay if you just come to class to listen. I'm not going to deduct participation points, because sometimes your job is just to listen. So if I have a student who's like, they feel uncomfortable, I'm going to be like, that's fine, but you better be a very good active listener, because sometimes our job is to listen, especially if you're a white student who has no concept of what we're about to talk about. I think it is important for you to maybe not contribute and to listen, actually. And that shocks them, because, in language classrooms, participation is key, but to give them that liberty and to make them understand that listening is just as important as sharing your opinion, really impacts the students. But I feel like that's a future thing, to talk about how to manage these conversations, because I think delivery is key. And putting a lot of the power in the students' hands is also key. So I feel like that's a future conversation.
Ledge is raising a really good point too through the chat. It says militant approach is more likely to create resistance, and that's true. I mean, we need to also be aware on how we share. I wanted to share with you. Oh, we're really out. I mean, if you need to leave, you can leave. Sorry.
You are always keeping your time, and then all of a sudden.
Oh, I'm this is our syllabi. I mean, our syllabus for Spanish. And a couple of semesters ago with the Spanish group.
It was in December.
Bueno.
We just did it.
Señora. We talked about learning environment in our classes, and because there was a discussion about that. I mean, sometimes students feel uncomfortable, and sometimes students feel like, what are you doing? Shouldn't you be teaching me how to ask for coffee? What are you doing discussing race? So we put it as a part of your learning experience, not also to come clean to them, but also to have some accountability on them. Like, you need to engage with this, and you're not gonna always be comfortable. They get so scared the first day because I really, we are very straight face. I'm like, this is gonna happen. But in some way it prepares them, this language prepares them to be more open. I'm not saying that this is a recipe for success, but to elicit as much as we can and make it explicit as much as we can. I usually go on that side of the over explanation. Hi, we're doing this because of that, because sometimes it's all in my head, and then they get only the output, and they say, okay, but why are we seeing this again? What is this? So you want to read it, Luciris, or we let people read it by themselves?
I mean, it's
read. Yes.
Yeah. So it's the three things about being collaborative and owning, what you bring. I think the last topic is the most important one. Things are going to be uncomfortable. Things are going to be controversial, but you just have to be respectful. And I also think it works both ways, because at the beginning of my teaching career, I had a hard time being respectful to students who didn't agree with me. Because I was like, how dare you? I think back then it was Rigoberta Menchú, who apparently is the only Guatemalan person we can talk about in Spanish classes. The person was critiquing Rigoberta Menchú, and I went off. And I forced that student to have his final essay be about Rigoberta Menchú, because I was so mad. Yeah, so I feel like this learning environment is also for us as instructors to make sure that if the goal is for these kids to be more aware of these things, then I should be willing to modify my delivery to get to that goal, right? And so
Yes.
anger has a place, but also, being patient and not militant has a place. And if you tell me that I cannot be militant and angry, but that the kid is going to be informed, I'll take that any day. Because ultimately what I want is that kid to be informed.
Yeah,
But that, I mean,
it's a contract.
yeah. And it took, I'm 40. I barely got to this conclusion recently, because I was a very angry teacher for a long time. Poor kids. I should go back and apologize for my angry version.
We all been there. I mean, we were discussing, because I already mentioned this, but I took the students to Buenos Aires, and I'm like, you're in Buenos Aires, you're gonna go to see the desaparecidos, you're gonna learn about the dictatorship, you're gonna learn about US involvement in Latin American dictatorship. And then I see other programs that they're like, hey, let's go eat, let's go enjoy the country. And I'm this angry Argentinian woke person, and poor little things. I mean, we did fun stuff too, but then it comes a point when you have to actually be aware of what do you want to teach, because it's I lost my word. What do you want to teach because it's something they need, or what do you want to teach because it goes along with the image you have of yourself? Divya, is that a hand?
Yes, that's a hand. So I love the syllabus, and I think what you were also earlier talking about, how to have these difficult conversations. I think another thing that I would want to add is a lot of our students might be coming from those alternate perspectives who have never talked about this, and might be really uncomfortable because it could be a reality check for them. And finding yourself in the wrong, so to speak, for a lack of a better word, is difficult, especially if you have grown up with those experiences and you could still have the same environment around you outside of class. So I think we also need to probably have space in class to say, to normalize change of opinions, to normalize growth. So even if I came into this class thinking a certain way, but now that I have had time to receive new information, I am beginning to change my mind. And that is normal. Like, those are not fixed qualities. And we want to celebrate that change. I think our goal is not just to say, are you completely reformed, but also to celebrate that journey. And I think we need to constantly message that to the students, because as you are sharing your journey, how baby Lucilis did something in the past, but now she thinks differently, right? I think hearing that makes it okay for me to say, for me to share, well, I didn't do this either. So I think when we normalize that, even in our classes, that would send a strong message to the students on how to vocalize that.
And we can do that for them. Yes, absolutely.
I think that goes with what's happening now with cancel culture. I think that one of my favorite memes that I saw this week is be quick to counsel rather than cancel, right? And if we're in education, maybe we believe in cancel culture outside of, of academia, but I think academia is the space where we do allow growth and where we are supposed to be focused on, you are allowed to change your mind, to have a different perspective, especially in education. And I think that's very true, Divya. We need to make these students, because I think the other thing that happens is posturing. So the students know that I'm a fierce Chicana, feminist, etc. They're just gonna do what they need to do to make sure that I'm happy, right? And I never get to know who they are. But if we make the space safe enough,
so quickly.
Yes. So if you make the space safe and say, we're here to learn, it is okay to, it's actually good to have a change of opinion when you have new knowledge, to admit that you were wrong because you didn't have knowledge. That's, yeah, you're right, Divya. That's, if anywhere, it needs to happen in the classroom, the room to grow with the receiving of new knowledge.
Absolutely. And also because sometimes we are not able to see how much of an authoritative figure we are when we are inside the classroom. We like to think, I mean, I'm more laid back, I do jokes in my classroom and whatnot, and I try to be this cool professor and whatnot, but I'm still a professor, and there's still a gap there that I have to take into account if I want to try to make it smaller, not even shut it, because you cannot shut it down. So yeah, taking into account and be able to share instances where you were wrong and you learn, and you can model that for them. I think that also opens the discussion, and to not be afraid to be wrong.
I mean, I think we're at the end.
We're like 20 minutes past.
I know, 25. I mean, you guys are like, I feel like we should all go have coffee, to be honest.
Yeah, we should like buy lunch for everyone, but no.
Un cafecito and just.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yes.
No, thank you for providing this space. I have more questions that I will write and then send to you guys. So we could continue this conversation, because this has been delightful. I really needed this starting the semester, and like being able to learn from you has been amazing.
No, thank you.
You guys can still access the Jamboard if you want to put the comments there in an anonymous way. It's still open. Sorry, Lucy. Sorry.
No.